Let's bring in a senior writer at the New Zealand Herald. He is a friend of the show. It is Simon Wilson. Hello, Simon.
Hi there, Pat.
Now, have you
Hiya,
paid your
Simon.
fee? Have you paid your
Hi,
fee to
Joey.
come on tonight? Because all of our people now have to pay us a fee to come on and speak. Because that's how we're
Oh,
going.
okay. So, right. Okay. Can I do it in like chocolate fish or something?
Yeah,
Or
that's perfect.
how
Actually,
will it work?
that's absolutely perfect. That's absolutely perfect. Lovely to have you on,
Wait.
Simon. We love having you on.
Like just one each, right?
Well, I get two.
We're not going to share.
I
Not
get two,
gonna
and
share.
I get two, and Chewie gets one. That's how it works.
Oh,
But then I have to
okay.
give my two away because I'm still dieting, so I end up with none. But that's my choice, so that's fine. It's like if I get $20 and give it to my kids because that's what seems to happen when you're a parent. I still technically got the $20, but I just don't see any value from it. Anyway, let's move on. We love having you on, Simon. We love talking about the topics that you write about as a senior writer at the New Zealand Herald. Really interesting article that was out. It was out today, wasn't it? 23rd?
Yep,
Yeah,
today.
out today. Climate change. Simon Wilson says Christopher Luxon gets it right and terribly wrong on New Zealand steel. I'm actually going to just read the first part of this, and then I want to get your thoughts, and we're going to expand on the whole conversation. Christopher Luxon is right, says Simon Wilson. He says government should not be paying for the multinational corporates to reduce their carbon emissions when they're perfectly capable of doing it themselves. But Luxon is also ridiculously wrong. Here's why. NZ Steel, which is owned by the Australian company BlueScope, will receive up to $140 million from the government to install an electric arc furnace at its Glenbrook plant. This will reduce its carbon emissions by 45%. BlueScope made a record Australian $2.81 billion in profit last year. It doesn't need the bribe. Subsidy. But New Zealand Steel boss Robin Davies blithely told Radio New Zealand yesterday it would not have taken this step on its own because there would be no direct financial benefit. In the next breath, he had the nerve to add insult to injury by declaring that everybody is committed to fighting climate change. So, Simon, we can see why Mr. Luxon might have been right. And I think we would all agree with you. If you've got profits of $2.81 billion, you can pay $140 million yourself. Why was he wrong?
Why he's wrong is that the way in which we need to fight climate change is that all the levers have to be pushed. Now, that's a phrase that our mayor in Auckland, Wayne Brown, likes to use when he's talking about cutting budgets. But there are carrots and sticks. There are, in other words, there are incentives and there have to be regulations as well.
Mm-hmm.
We know there's a couple of big things we know about climate change. And the first one is that the big corporates and actually the wealthiest people in the world are way disproportionately more responsible for the crisis we're in than the rest of us. I don't have the figures to hand, but there's a very, very tiny number of people and corporates that are responsible for well over half the world's emissions.
Right.
That's the first thing we know. The second thing we know is that they're actually not doing very much about it. And we're talking about obviously fossil fuel companies, and that's companies that are engaged in coal and oil and gas. The companies like car companies that work with them. The finance companies that prop them up, that enable them to do their business, and the governments that prop both of those sectors up as well. So knowing those two things, that actually there is a problem that is principally caused by that sector and that they are not doing the things they need to do, we need a range of tools to address them. And at one end of the extreme, and we may want to talk about this, one end of the extreme is people who stop coal mines from producing coal, stop oil pipelines from functioning by puncturing them. Those sorts of actions, that's at one end of it. And at the other end of it is governments that are doing their best to pull those big polluters into line. Now, I believe that the principal weapon that governments should use to do that is regulation. I believe that the government should be saying, for example, we're going to put a limit on the number of internal combustion engine vehicles that can be imported into this country, and it's going to come soon. And we're certainly going to put a limit on the number of particularly harmful ones that are imported. So we really try and speed up that transition. I believe those regulations are vital. But for all those corporates that are part of this whole problem, there also has to be incentives. There also has to be ways to say to them, okay, if we spend a bit of money with you, will that tip you from being outside the tent into being inside the tent? And I think that's what the government's done here. So Luxon's right to say these corporates don't need the incentive, but actually the incentive has tipped New Zealand Steel from being a company that was sitting outside the tent to one that has a capacity now to be at least partly in the tent. And that's going to be a good thing for us.
It seems interesting as well, because I don't want to speak on behalf of Mr. Luxon, although he would love me to. But typically on the right, I think you get stuck in this quagmire that they don't want to necessarily impose more cost on business, but then they also, which would be like a stick, but they don't want to also give away taxpayers' monies to business, which would be a carrot, but they also don't want to then add more regulations. In fact, this upcoming potential government has said, they're not an upcoming government yet, but if National get in, they've talked about, for every new regulation coming in straight out of Trump's playbook, we're going to take 2 out. So it's like, what is a right-wing government in general actually left with to encourage a group to get on board with climate change when actually they probably don't want to regulate, they don't want to give away money, and they don't want to hand out a stick in some form of fine against their business buddies?
Look, I tell you what, in my view, we're looking at the modern form of denialism. Denialism used to be climate change doesn't exist. And then it was climate change does exist, but it's not really relevant to us. And then it was, well, actually, yeah, we do have those floods, we do have those droughts, so it is relevant to us, but we can't do anything about it. And there are still a lot of people saying that, but those who have moved past that are still finding other ways to say there's no way in which that all the suggestions you're making for how we deal with this, they're just not quite good enough. It's not quite good enough to deal with New Zealand Steel this way. It's not quite good enough to have that fee-based scheme. It's not, on and on and on and on. And what it all adds up to is we're not going to do anything. And if you're in position in this debate is actually we don't think we should do anything, it's just going to sort itself out in some way, that is a form of denialism. I think I was going to say there's another factor that comes in with this. I chaired a panel on in the Auckland Writers Festival over the weekend on climate change, and I asked the question of the panelists: do they think climate change is a left-wing issue, or is it an issue that everybody should be getting involved with?
Right.
Do you believe that the causes of the climate crisis are the same as the causes of poverty and therefore have to be fought in the same way? Or do you believe that actually those are the big emitters, those are the finance companies that prop them up, and we need them to stop, and therefore we need them to understand this is their fight too? And I don't have a settled position on that argument, actually. But when the Luxons of this world and the Simeon Browns as his transport spokesperson keep saying, oh, none of that's good enough, that's just wrong, we can't do it that way, we can't do it that way, we can't do it that way. When they keep saying all that, to my mind, they box themselves into a corner. Why would you leave it to the left? If you are serious at all, if you're on the right in this country or anywhere, and you think climate change is a problem, why do you leave it to the left? Why don't you come out with a coherent policy that will make a difference and that will work, and own this thing yourself?
The article finishes with something echoing just what you've said. You say this: it's time for National Party to step off the sidelines of the climate debate. Luxon said yesterday he was, quote, on the side of Kiwi battlers, end quote. It's an insidious form of climate denialism to suggest, quote, Kiwi battlers, end quote, don't need climate action and or need a government to prepare the force, cajole, and to be prepared to force, cajole, and when necessary bribe big emitters into it. It's what you're basically saying there, right? It's like, it's that kind of fish or cut bait. It's time to either get in or be honest about the denialism. Don't just kind of use mealy mouthed kind of code words. What do we call it? Wolf whistles? No, not wolf whistles. Dog whistles.
Dog whistles.
Wolf whistles.
I think you're right. This problem will solve itself somewhere down the line because of market forces and because we're all going to have lots of windmills and solar anyway, and we'll all drive EVs and it'll solve itself. In other words, nobody has to do anything. If that's not how it works. That's not how the world works. That's not how climate action is coming at us, how the climate crisis is coming at us. And it is a way of simply saying, we're just going to bury my head in the sand for a while here, and I hope it'll go away.
And, I mean, this is obviously something the government's been working on for a little while to make this big announcement that it's all done and dusted. And I think the fact of like, if it was a negotiation along the lines of, we need you to do this, and if you agree to it, then we're going to give you this money.
Yeah.
It's an immediate sort of thing, right? It's underway now, and it's funded from the ETS.
That's right. Funded from the ETS. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So it's funded from the ETS. They have been working on it for a while, and there is a strategic value to us. This is a company that was saying less than a year ago, if you apply the ETS to us, we're going to close up shop in New Zealand. There will not be steel produced in New Zealand. Now, James Shaw, the climate change minister, has, in my view, quite rightly said, we need a more circular economy in this country. We need the capacity. Manufacturing and industry need the capacity to have locally produced steel. And if we can do it in a greener way, it's not just good for the emissions that are reduced because we're doing it in a more green way. It's also good for the circular economy. So in the case he uses here is that old cars, instead of being shipped offshore and God knows where they end up, those cars will now be, the scrap metal will now be melted down, resmelted, and turned into new steel for new uses. And I suggested in my column that I'm absolutely looking forward to buying a bicycle made from scrapped double cab utes.
Hey, let me get both of your opinion on this, because there's something that you've written in the article as well, which speaks to what we're talking about, but also I think more broadly to what often the right do to kind of wash their hands of things. And that's they go, we just trust people. We'll trust they'll do the right thing. You say this. This is Christopher Luxon speaking. I've gone and met with the CEO and the management team of New Zealand Steel and saw the site myself late last year. I really like the direction of where they're going, but they are quite capable of fronting up the $140 million themselves. You go on to say he trusts the company to do the right thing on its own. After they did a snow job on him last year, it's absurdly naive, and Davies had frankly admitted as much. We hear this a lot. We hear this with David Seymour. Mm-hmm. These ideas that we can trust people to do the right thing. It is always ironic when they say that sort of thing about tax and money and, carrot and stick, but they won't say that kind of thing about things like cannabis or back in the day about same-sex marriage or whatever. So they seem to want to trust people, business, when it comes to this sort of thing and not otherwise. But I guess I'll ask both of you, Chewy, you can jump in on this as well, obviously. Is this a tactic of the right to kind of push it down the street? It's like we can trust them; they'll do the right thing. I've done my bit. Is that what he's doing, Simon?
If you go back and you think Luxon comes out of that world, when he walked into the boardroom at New Zealand Steel, I imagine he felt pretty much at home. He is comfortable in boardrooms. Now that is his background, and so there's a language they talk to each other, and they would have recognized it. And that if you look at any of the pronouncements about climate change that corporate leaders make, sometimes there's serious content there, but a lot of the time it's the cliche term is greenwash, but it's also you can recognize in it a real desire to do this in a way that we'll only do this if it makes us money. And I don't know, I just have a real problem with that. We expect citizens to be good citizens, and I think we should expect corporate citizens to be good corporate citizens. And we live in a time now where that has to mean nobody can only be acting on the basis of, am I going to be able to make a buck out of this? Yeah, we have larger...
I'm glad you mentioned that, trusting people to be good citizens and that sort of thing. And I think there's a fundamental thing here with the right-wing parties, and that they'll trust giant corporate entities with massive profits they'll eventually do the right thing. We definitely don't want to regulate them. That'll scare them off and they'll run away. But people, the citizenry, do not get that same. Exactly. They're not trusted. They're not trusted to raise their kids right. They're not trusted to put their lives back on track. There's lots of regulation. There's lots of stick there if you're an individual. But if you're a company, if you're a massive international conglomeration, we're all kind of like, oh, we're so glad that you're here in our little country. We're just going to let you do what you want. We've seen that with Comelco and Rio Tinto and that sort of thing. And I'm sure, the very prospect of steel production heading offshore would have scared the shit out of people.
Yeah.
So maybe this is the best way forward, is that we've gone, hey, look, well, if you're going to do this, we'll have a negotiation. Here's some money in the pot. Job done. Big hit off our carbon emissions. We don't have to talk about regulations.
It is the biggest hit off our carbon emissions of any single thing that's been done, which is not to say it's all that big. It's going to, we're told it's going to reduce them by 1%, which clearly shows you how big the task is in front of us.
Yeah. As a little side note, Simon, you would have heard us while you were in the waiting room talking about people asking for merch and stuff. I've just come up with our first T-shirt. You ready for this, guys? So on the between the shoulder blades, we'll have BHN, and on the front, we'll have Luxon. He's a board member, not a businessman, because you reminded me of that, which is something we've been saying here for weeks, Simon. He's not a businessman, he's a board member. So I think I've got our first T-shirt. I think we might have to talk to your missus, Cherry, about designing us a T-shirt.
Just speaking of that, businessmen and board members, can I just crave your indulgence to talk about just something else that was in my column today as well?
If you have to. No, of course.
Got a moment.
We're here.
Okay.
Yeah, of course.
I'm absolutely sick. We had budget last week, right? I'm absolutely sick of hearing from business leaders telling us that there's this or that in a budget or an economic pronouncement, and they are narrowly focused on what will it do for the business in terms of its bottom line. Yes. And I used the example of the Employers and Manufacturers Federation, who were complaining along those lines. And I used the example of the childcare, the extension of the childcare subsidy. Childcare subsidies are good for business. They're good for parents and they're particularly good for the children, but they're also good for business because they produce more productive workers who find it easier to keep up because they can go back to work more easily. They produce happier workers. All those things are good for a productive economy and therefore good for business as well. And on top of that, children who go through good childcare get to 5 and get to school, and they are not behind the other kids. And because they're not behind the other kids, they're not going to stay behind the other kids. And because of that, they are less likely to drop out to become the kids who grow up to become real problems. Yeah. Childcare is incredibly important for producing, apart from all the social goods it produces, it's incredibly important for producing numerate and literate and educated workers for business. And it's about time, in my view, that business started to talk like that.
Yeah. Yes. I think we made the same point, Simon, about the $5 prescription fee as well. Exactly. It's like if people can get their medicine and get well sooner, and parents don't have to stay home with kids, and they can get back to work, and kids don't miss days of school, these social issues or these social policies aren't seen by, as you're saying, people as being good for business, but they fucking are. Of course they are.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's real shallow thinking. It's just very surface. We'll take it on the headline. We won't dig deeper. I mean, I saw someone saying that for every $1 we spend on the prescription subsidy, getting rid of that, then the country gets like $9 back out of productivity. That's a good deal.
Yeah,
I think. Yeah, I think talking about business.
I know a doctor at Middlemore Hospital who believes that's just the single best thing that she's heard in a very long time because of what we'll do for the people they deal with. Yeah.
Hey, we've encouraged people to join us live because we're live tonight, Simon. It's not a pre-record. So let's just there's lots of comments in there. Let's get a couple of comments up about this conversation and then we'll let you go, Simon, and we'll move on. Political Kiwi says, trusting people to be good citizens is nice, but corporations are like those twats who claim to be sovereign citizens to get out of facing consequences for their actions. Money is universal language.
That's a good point.
Political Kiwi says. Sunset says, if Labour didn't help fund New Zealand Steel and other businesses in CO2 reduction, Luxon would go on. I'm going to just adapt this a little bit for Sunset. Luxon would go on and on and on and on and on and on and on about Labour adding cost to business, but when Labour give funding, they're spending too much. Yeah. So it's you can't win. It's a lose-lose as far as Nationals saying at the time. All right, now Simon, because we've just gone into another topic, is there anything else you'd like to wrap up with before we move on?
No, I've done that. Thank you.
Okay, good. It's always amazing to talk to you, Simon. We really enjoy having you as a part of the show. Thanks for coming on tonight, and I'm sure we'll talk to you super soon.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Cheery.